email. I started out at the University of British Columbia in the 1960s. I got a job offer from the City University of New York, and we moved back out to the Great Pacific Northwest, and UBC lets me use their name. So that's the basis of that. So the model that I'm working with is, I've dubbed it the Cellular Basis of Consciousness. CBC is, CBC is also to honor the Canadian Broadcasting Company. I thought about the name of the model for a long time and decided that that was a good way to do it. The model has a couple of basic assumptions. Sentience accompanies life. Now this echoes what František just told us an hour or so ago. From my perspective, it's incoherent to think of life without there being some sentience behind it, some feeling, some subjectivity. It simply doesn't make any sense. By the way, I didn't always think that way. I think very few people thought that way until a few years ago, and now increasingly people are recognizing that's a reasonable assumption to start with. The reason is because it's essential for survival. If you're not getting feedback about what's good and what's bad, what's nutritious and what's toxic, and if you're not having representations of this that have a subjective component to it, you're a Darwinian dead end. And so it seems like this is an essential component. Therefore, all sensory experience, even the simplest kind of sensory experience, having to do with just an event occurring out there, that something about its light or its sound or its vibrational properties or its capacity to make contact with you is subjective. It's felt. I know Professor Harnett likes the word felt. He feels that that's an essential component of this issue, and I'm in agreement with him, which is always dangerous. You don't want to be in agreement with Stephen because things are always much more interesting when you disagree with them. The goal of the theory is to resolve the hard problem. Now, the hard problem famously was so dubbed by David Chalmers. It's become so famous that it has to be put in capital letters, hard with a capital H and P with a capital, problem with a capital P. The effort to solve the hard problem has proven to be difficult. It has crashed on the shoals of logic, research, philosophical debate, and just plain pissiness from a lot of people who just really get their dander up with about it. I'm not going to solve the hard problem. No one's going to solve the hard problem, certainly not with regard to the contemporary work that we're doing. But what I hope to do in the next hour is to resolve the hard problem by restructuring it and refocusing it. Now, I'm getting there. The hard problem. Someone doesn't know what the hard problem is. Oh, that's just so heartwarming. How do brains make minds? Or, to phrase it another way, how can the material make the mental? The argument basically is, look, you open up the human skull, take a look, you got 3 pounds of porridge. It's stuff. It's just stuff. It's biochemical stuff. It's water. It's molecules. And somehow it makes sentience. It makes a mind. And you know, you scratch your head and look at this and say, how can this possibly be? And this is one of the oldest, most fundamental philosophical issues really of all time. In fact, the editors of Science a few years ago called this the second most important unanswered scientific question. It's hard to come more important than that one because number one was, what's the universe made of? So we're talking about big stuff here. These are the sorts of things that have attracted the attention of philosophers, scientists, theologians, poets. It's an almost irresistible topic. And if you start thinking about it, it really starts to gnaw on you. How does stuff make something mental? How do you get subjectivity from a bunch of neurons? And the efforts to answer this have produced a veritable cottage industry of approaches, orientations, theories, models, debates, confusions. It's been going on for, a good 3 centuries. The focus lately has been on this thing about how does the human brain make the human mind? Now, one of the things that has emerged in the middle of all this dispute and debate is, does it really have to be organic? Does it really have to be a human brain? An alternative was proposed by the philosopher Hilary Putnam back in 1981, what has come to be called the hardware-independent functionalism. And the argument is, it's the functions that are carried out. It's the computations that are done that count. It doesn't matter what it's made up of. It doesn't have to be neurons. It doesn't have to be a human brain. It can be based on silicon. It can be based on tin cans and string. It can be based on water pipes. It doesn't matter. As long as the entity, the system, the artificial system carries out the appropriate computations, then magically, boink, consciousness will emerge from it. So this is an effort to solve the hard problem. And it's a way to solve it by saying, look, you don't need to look at this brain because that's just getting you in trouble. What you really need to do is to study the computational structure, the cognitive functions that are carried out, and if you can instantiate them in an artificial intelligence, an AI, or today they talk about an artificial general intelligence because they want ones that are, domain general as opposed to domain specific, then you are going to get human consciousness. It's going to pop right out of it. Now, this has been attacked. Obviously, you can't make a proposal like this without being attacked. The attack started with John Süel in what he called the Chinese room. I happen to be among a relatively few members of a small cohort that think Süel was right. In philosophy, you never, ever agree with another philosopher. It's just not done. The game is to criticize. I mean, this is not a criticism of criticism. This is the way you want to do it because this keeps everybody honest and you keep your arguments well honed and sharpened and you're ready for the attack. But I'm a psychologist, so I can agree with a philosopher and get away with it. By the way, just a quick little tidbit here. In 1981, I had the good fortune to be a fellow at the Summer Institute for the Philosophy and Psychology of Mind. There were something like 40 philosophers there and 4 psychologists. And Süel came and spent a deliciously combative day with us, putting forward his arguments about how hardware-independent functionalism was bankrupt. Not a single philosopher agreed with a word he said. And the 4 psychologists looked at each other and went, sounds good to me, which I thought was just a fascinating, disciplinary distinction between us. So briefly, artificial intelligence, a computer or a robot cannot become conscious. That's my position, and I'm sticking to it. If anyone wants a fight about it, invite me, and I'll give another talk on it, but I'm not going to do that here. We're going on to the effort to resolve the hard problem. And the big question is, which species have minds? Now, one of the nice things about František's presentation was he started out by saying all species have minds. And I agree with that. But that actually is a radical position. František presented everything so neatly and smoothly that it just seemed like it was perfectly obvious. But in fact, that's a rather radical position if you look at the larger scope of work in this field. Because what people did was to start with humans. Again, František pointed this out. By the way, when he put that first slide up, I'm sitting there and I leaned over to Rhiannon and I said, is he going to give my talk? because he really captures the essence of what I'm going to do in that first slide. The thing he pointed out, which is absolutely right, is because philosophers have been the ones that have framed this debate and dragged the neuroscientists and the neurocognitivists into it. They started with humans. They started with human consciousness. And the exercise went like this. Okay, look, what do people do? Well, they solve problems, they have memory, they can learn, they make decisions, they have emotions, they have feelings. What are the underlying neurocognitive structures that modulate, control, and coordinate these activities? So then the fMRI gang comes out, and then the EEG guys come out, and they start probing and looking around and finding, well, okay, wait a minute, you need the frontal lobes. All right, if you need the frontal lobes, because that's where consciousness is, then we gotta play the next game. We gotta go find the species that has the analogous or the root, the primordial root structures that ultimately give rise over evolution to human consciousness. So now the exercise begins. Look backward. And look backward as far as you can go until you find the components, you find the neurological basis that looks like the analog in the human being, and you can say, bang, that's the species where consciousness first emerges. This is the species where we can say, this critter has a mind. So, what is it that they can do? Well, basically what people point to is learn, form memories, make decisions. These are the three biggies. There are a bunch of others, but these are the ones that are most often cited. So let's just use the umbrella term sentience. I have a book coming out on this issue I have a book coming out on this issue soon, and I got into a fight with my editor. She wanted to know please define my terms, and could I specify each of these particular components that are involved in cognition? And I said, no, I'm not going to do it. I'm going to play fast and loose with terminology because it actually is a good thing to do in a situation like this. And the umbrella term that I'm going to use is sentience. It covers everything. So if you want to talk about memory, fine, that's part of sentience. You want to talk about emotional states, that's part of sentience. It's all part of the same thing as sentience, subjectivity, the internal representations that are there. So, given that framework and given the notion that people are looking backward through the evolutionary continuum to find the point where it begins, what have been the candidates? Well, entomologist Andrew Barron concluded that it was bees. Oh, by the way, a new paper just came out on bees, which is stunning. Bees have the concept zero. They know what the null set is. And this just knocked my socks off. And the study is brilliant. What they do is they have displays with different numbers of objects in front of them. And they're from 1 to 4. And they train some bees on greater than, and they learn to go to the display because there's nutrients there for them. The displays that have more than the other display. Now, if you give them 4 objects and 3, they're a little dicey. But 4 and 2, they're good, and 4 and 1, they knock it dead. Then they trade others to go to the lesser one. That is, they go to the display that has fewer objects in it. And then the test. A display with nothing in it versus a display with 2 objects in it. And they go to the nothing. So they know what 0 is. They appreciate the null set. And they know it's the number, not the objects, because they change the display so that it's a different shape, and they still go to the 0 one. Now that's stunning because they only have like 100 million neurons. And that may sound like a lot, but it's chump change. Nematodes have millions of neurons. A fruit fly expert, Van Swinderen, he decided that fruit flies have consciousness. Whether fruit flies can represent the number 0? I don't know. The study, as far as I know, hasn't been done yet. Cephalopod expert, Peter Godfrey Smith, and after all of his research, he decided that it was to be found in cephalopods, in particular octopuses, although he's also pretty sure that cuttlefish have minds as well. Avian researcher, everyone knows Irene Pepperberg and her famous parrot. After many, many years of studying, she came to the conclusion that indeed the emergence of consciousness takes place in the avian species. Linguist Ewan MacPhail came up with an interesting one. He decided that, in fact, the only species that has consciousness is the human being, and no other species does. Every other species is simply responding in very mechanical ways without any subjectivity or representation. Anybody notice anything interesting here? Consciousness seems to be where you look for it, which tends to have been where you've been looking all along. There's a deeper problem here. I don't know whether anyone spotted it. It's the Emergentist's dilemma. How does consciousness appear in a species when one cosmic moment before it wasn't there? If you decide that somewhere along the emergence and the evolutionary scale, consciousness puts in an appearance, sort of marches onto the subjective stage, as it were, the epistemic stage, what happens there that didn't happen before? Why does an avian species suddenly display consciousness when an insect did not? Or if you think an insect did, why did it display consciousness when worms do not, or sea anemone do not? And no one really seems to have addressed this. There are a number of philosophical arguments that try to deal with the emergentist dilemma. I won't get into them because I don't think that they're exercises that are worth pursuing. They may be within philosophy, but I don't think they are within what I hope to be focusing on here, which is hard-nosed science. Yes, we already did that. So here's the CBC's radical proposal. Consciousness comes with life. Single-cell species are conscious. Prokaryotes, bacteria, are conscious. It emerges with life. It comes with the very first species. They really only have very tiny minds, but they're there. And actually, as we'll see in a minute, they're a little more sophisticated than perhaps most folks recognize. So a quick look at the evidence. What do organisms with minds do? Well, they learn, they remember, they make decisions, and they communicate. Startlingly, bacteria do all of these things. The E. coli swimming in your gut right now. By the way, there's some good ones and some bad ones, and hopefully most of yours are the good ones. They're rather extraordinary. Let's take a quick look at one of my favorites, Stentor roeseli. I never heard of Stentor roeseli till I got involved in this little game of tracking down the origins of consciousness. You should know I'm a cognitive psychologist. I spend my life studying what I call implicit learning, or the way in which the cognitive unconscious functions outside of awareness. Just briefly, about close to 30 years ago, I started thinking about the origins of consciousness because of my interest in this balance between those things that we are aware of and those things we are not. And it just sort of, sat there in the back burner of my brain for a while till I had a conversation with a caterpillar. And actually, Stephen knows about this because he was at the first presentation of this model, which is in 1995, when I was invited to give a talk at the British Psychological Society. And it's when I first revealed. Yeah. No, the caterpillar is, it consumed the basil in my garden and then it vanished. It turned into a moth, not surprisingly perhaps. But when I started getting into this, I stumbled across some work on Stentor roeseli The fascinating thing about this research, that I'll tell you about in a second, is it was done in 1906. It's been sitting there in the literature for 120 plus years, and practically no one has paid any attention to it. I got cued in on it by my friend. This is in this world of the internet. My friend Dennis Bray and I have never met. We merely communicate through email, and he's taught me a great deal about the lives of very teeny tiny things. He's one of Britain's the world's leading microbiologists. So let's take a quick look. Stentor it looks complex, but this is a single cell organism. It's a eukaryote, so it has its DNA encapsulated in a membrane inside. See this little funnel up here? That's its mouth, basically. What it does is it just hangs around and waits for molecules to come into its mouth. And what it does is it evaluates their, I know I'm using very conscious terms, it evaluates its significance. If it's food, it absorbs it and extracts the nutrients from it. If it's not food, it ejects it. And it ejects it in a very stylized way. It bends over and shakes to get the nasty little, particles that have come in out. What Jennings did was to drop in a red dye, though he could see it easily, and it is a noxious stimulus. Stentor really doesn't like it. So he dropped it in, Stentor bends over, shakes and gets rid of it. He drops some more particles in, the same ritualized response is done. He dropped in some more of it. He dropped in some more of it, and then puts his hand over the little aquarium that he's working in. Stentor pulls its mouth down inside the body so that no more particles can come in. Now, notice what's happening here, folks. First, Stentor is escaping from noxious molecules. So clearly it is detecting that this substance is, if not toxic, certainly unpleasant. But it learns to avoid them. It makes a preparatory prophylactic response by closing down its funnel to prevent any more noxious particles from coming in. After a few seconds, it goes, okay, coast is clear. It opens back up again, starts looking for nutrients. Jennings dropped it back down again. And Stentor, which is a sessile species, that is, it puts down a foot and it roots itself in a spot, tears its foot away, swims off to another location, and reestablishes its sessile life over there to get away from this environment that has clearly become a toxic environment. This is a stunning series of behaviors for a single-celled organism. And it's pretty hard to look at this and not do a little anthropomorphism. By the way, again, let me thank František this morning for pointing out the importance of anthropomorphism. We used to think anthropomorphism was a fallacy. We call it the anthropomorphic fallacy. This was driven into our brains by the behaviorists in the 1950s and 60s and 70s. But in fact, anthropomorphism is a very powerful tool when it's used in a careful way and it's used with common sense. And a little anthropomorphism here, I think, is a good thing, particularly with what we just saw Stentor is capable of. But even more interesting is that the simplest species on the planet, bacteria, can do. So, learning in bacteria. Pippel's group in Israel, lovely series of studies. They shifted nutrients back and forth between sucrose and maltose. Now, in case you don't know this, and I didn't know it until not too long ago, bacteria make changes in metabolic function in order to efficiently deal with the food source that is in their environment. And the way in which the underlying structural characteristics of their metabolism is established is different for sucrose than it is for maltose. So what they did is to go sucrose, maltose, back boom, 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 boom. And fairly quickly, the bacteria adapt so that after they've consumed the sucrose, they immediately begin changing the underlying metabolic functions so that they're able to metabolize maltose more effectively than they would be normally. So what they then did was to continue the sucrose maltose back and forth, and then follow the last maltose with more maltose. Now, if they're simply in a state where they are processing the maltose, then they should be fine. But if they're in this go back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, and learning that there's a sequence here that they have to anticipate, they should have trouble with it because now they've shifted their metabolism back to handling the sucrose. And that's exactly what they found. When they presented maltose alone, the metabolic changes were not seen. They're back looking for sucrose and they're not getting it. Memory. Why this is such tiny print, I don't know, but there it is. Mathis and Ackerman's group exposed bacteria to near toxic levels in a water solution. They use high levels of salt. Now, the species that they work with is a sessile species, and what they did was to use such a high concentration that it caused cell death, and those surviving cells then divide. Because it's a sessile, a stationary species, the mother cell stays there. The daughter cells would separate; they swim away, so they leave the environment. But the mother cells, they stay in the same environment. They then reintroduce the salt solution, and we can anticipate what they find, I'm assuming. The mother cells, the ones who stayed behind in the same location, they remember the salt solution. And they had relatively high survival rates because they made the adjustments in their metabolic function to be able to protect them against the salt solution. But the daughter cells, the ones who relocated, they suffered much higher cell death rates despite having the exact same DNA. So we know we're dealing with something that's learned. We know we're dealing with something that's a memory. And fascinatingly, these memories last for up to 2 hours. These are species that under ideal conditions reproduce every 20 minutes. They don't have very long lifespans. To be able to retain information like this and to maintain control over your metabolic function, to anticipate the occurrence, the reoccurrence of noxious input is astonishing. I mean, I find it astonishing. It may be, run-of-the-mill stuff to you. Decision-making in bacteria. Yene Kondev's group discovered that bacteria switch genes on and off depending upon the food source. Well, we already saw that with the sucrose shifting back and forth from Pippel's group. The mechanism is point out here is likely the one that lies behind Pippel's findings. The fascinating thing is that these studies, Kondev has done a number of series of studies on this, and finally in a review paper, he wrote, "It is not crazy to say that bacteria have free will." Now, when you start getting biologists using terms like this, it's really quite engaging. I rather enjoyed that one. Communication in bacteria. Bacteria communicate in often surprising ways. Süel's group found the bacteria at the center of a colony can ask the ones on the edge to control cell division. Now, let me briefly explain what this is about. Bacteria form molecular mats. They form like a film, a biofilm. And in fact, you're probably more familiar with these biofilms than you know, because when you wake up in the morning, they're on your teeth. They're on boat hulls. Bacteria just grow and the colonies grow and they adhere to each other and they form these films. Well, what happens in the real world is that these films can get themselves, these colonies, these collectives can get themselves into trouble. The problem is, as they grow, the nutrients are out there in the environment at the periphery of the unit. The cells in the center are having difficulty getting nutrients because it's not enough is flowing into the center of the film. At this point, they will send out a signal, a molecular signal, asking their brethren and sisterin in the periphery, slow down, guys, stop the cell division and stop eating everything because we're not getting enough in here. And they do. You get this very nice cooperative response from the cells in the periphery. They slow down metabolism, they stop dividing, the food flows in, the cells in the center are now getting sufficient nutrients. They change the metabolic output, they change the molecules that they release. This information gets to the periphery, and the guys on the periphery say, okay, it's time to start eating again. And they begin to consume. Fascinating thing about this is that in other studies, Süel's people found out that they can communicate with other colonies. You have one biofilm over here, and then somewhere else in the Petri dish, you have another biofilm. They're separated from each other. And now by carefully controlling the nutrient input, they can make one colony rich and happy and another one on a near starvation basis. The one that's in trouble from a nutrient basis now sends out a slightly different molecular compound. It's one that has electrical components to it, and it travels across the dish to the other one, and these guys now slow down. They say, oh, our friends over there are in trouble. Sorry for anthropomorphizing this to such a terrible extent. Our friends over there are in trouble. We will reduce our metabolic functions. We will reduce our reproduction rate until they recover. When they recover, they send another signal back, and it resumes and becomes normal again. At first, Süel's people thought this only took place within species. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that this is probably a general mechanism. And in fact, it is. And it turns out that it occurs across bacterial species. They will cooperate with each other. And now, this fascinating little piece of anthropomorphism here. Is this the first occurrence of altruism? It really looks like altruism. Cells at the edge of the colony are acting to save the lives of those in the center. And this is important. They're putting themselves at risk. See, one of the nice things about being in the center of the colony is you're protected. The toxic substances aren't getting to you. You're less likely to be attacked by predators. It's the cells on the periphery that are in most jeopardy. So when they reduce metabolic rate and when they stop reproducing, they're putting themselves at risk. They're putting themselves at risk for the benefit of other members of the colony. And right off the top of my head, that's exactly what anthropologists have determined altruism to be. Do I think that they're thinking altruistically? Do I think that they have thoughts like, oh, we got to save our friends? No, of course not. But all of these cognitive functions, all of these social functions have their roots in basic biological functions. And I don't think it's crazy to refer to this as the fundamental biological basis for what ultimately becomes altruistic behavior in more complex species. Because remember my hypothesis. The basic fundamental principle here is that all of the instantiations of cognitive and affective and social functions that we see in complex species have their evolutionary roots in more primitive and more basic, more fundamental components within simple organisms, right down to the prokaryotes. Interim summary. How am I doing on time? You got the time there? Okay, bacteria are pretty impressive. I think that's pretty clear. Prokaryotes show all of the behavioral features typically cited as the requirements of consciousness. These findings are just a few of the many reports in the literature, and from my point of view, they're all supportive of the CBC theory. Now, next question. Are there any entailments of taking the stance that it's recommended by the CBC? And the answer is absolutely. And this is going to get a little into some other issues because they have both philosophical and scientific components to them. Again, just briefly a little autobiographical information here. I only took one course in philosophy in my life, and it was a course called The Philosophy of History. And I signed up for it because I didn't think that was possible. I mean, how could there be a philosophy of history? History happened, right? You go back at dates and people did this and that to them. And then, well, it turns out there's a philosophy of history. And it turns out it's a pretty complicated and complex issue. And it's got me fascinated about history. And so the history of psychology became one of my subspecialties. And philosophy just, fell off the edge of the table until I got invited to be part of that 1981 Summer Institute. And now I have to get my philosophy chops back. And I embarrassed myself on a regular basis for the first 2 to 3 weeks of that 6-week institute. Things I thought I knew I didn't know. Words I thought I knew the meaning to, I didn't have a clue about. Concepts that I thought were simple and had already been resolved would turn out to have been far more complex than I ever imagined. This book of mine that's coming out soon, I don't think I could ever have written it if I knew anything about philosophy when I started, because I would have found myself caught up in this kind of, picking at your navel until it bleeds, because you just can't get out of this sort of philosophical whirlwind that you found yourself in. But by being a little naive and by being a little arrogant, I was able to make what I think are serious inputs, and talk about a couple of them here, because I honestly think that taking the CBC stance, the Cellular Basis of Consciousness stance, we can actually resolve a number of difficult problems that have bothered philosophers, particularly those in the philosophy of mind, for some time now. So, look at some conundrums resolved or reformulated, as opposed to sort of cleared up completely. The Emergentist dilemma is simplified. As long as we're looking for the species where somehow or other this magical thing called consciousness emerges, we're always going to be stuck with a really complicated issue. Why worms but not sea anemones? Why birds but not bees? Or if you like bees, why do you like bees? And this one, you're just going to bang your head against a bloody wall over and over again. If it starts with life, if all forms of consciousness emerge with the simplest emergence of life, you've got an emergentist dilemma. It's still there, but it's a tractable one. It's a relatively simple one. My guess is that when we figure out how life itself emerges, and again, that's another subfield within biology, we will discover that the events that occur there are the same ones that underlie sentience, that sentience emerges with life. You can't get life without sentience, and you can't get sentience without life. That those linkages are completely fixed. It only happened once. That's it. And what this leads us to is we don't commit the category error. One of the problems that David Chalmers dragged us into with the way in which he structured the hard problem is that it treats human consciousness as special. It treats it as though it's a different type, but it's not. It's just another token of a singular type. Human consciousness isn't different from other forms of consciousness, except in that it is capable of carrying out certain functions that other forms of consciousness are not. Our memory systems are more complex and involve a variety of different functions that are separate and distinct from the memory systems that we've seen in bacteria, but no one doubts that they're not the same. And it's an interesting tidbit. This kind of approach, which has been anathema to philosophers for a long time, is accepted as a perfectly legitimate strategy for research by people in the biomedical sciences. Candel's work on memory, for example, he discovered that the underlying molecular components that take place at the synapse can be found in sea slugs. And when they discovered it, and then they took a look at what was happening in humans, they found out that, in fact, it is the exact same mechanism. And the interesting thing, by the way, is that Candel, in his autobiography, says when he decided to do this work, his friends all said, don't do this. There's no possible way that anything you can find in Aplysia californica will generalize to the human memory system, but it does. And it's this tendency to think of the human functions, neurobiological and cognitive, as separate and distinct, that's gotten people into a great deal of trouble. All minds lie along a singular continuum. It's one type with a whole bunch of different tokens within it. So the other minds problem, which I do believe is a theme of this Summer Institute, it's neutralized. You don't have to worry about the other minds. They're everywhere. Everybody's got a mind. So you don't have to guess anymore. Now, there's still a question about how you know another mind. That's called the first person perspective problem. Like, how do I know you have a mind? Well, the first thing I do is give you, I just take a generous position here. I know I have one. You look like me, so I'm going to give you one. Right? This is what gets us into the anthropomorphic component. But then you start looking at nematodes, and they don't look like us. Or you look at octopuses. By the way, if you start asking, the typical person on the street whether they think this such and such a species has a mind, you find that it has a lot to do with how much they look like us. And they're pretty good with the chimpanzees, piece of cake. That's no problem at all. And mice. Oh, well, they have a face and they kind of like ours. And then you go to an octopus and they go, I don't think so. And say, well, why not? And they don't look like us. They're really different. In fact, they don't look like anything. Fascinating thing about an octopus, and there's no default unless it's not moving, and then it just turns into this blob. But they're very smart, by the way. If anyone's ever looked at octopuses, they're damn clever creatures, and there's little doubt that in anybody's mind that's looking at them that they have minds. But since everybody's got one, there's no guessing anymore. Mysterianism is avoided. Now, what's been happening here? People like Chalmers. I pick on Chalmers a lot in my book, so much so that I've had to put in a footnote apologizing for picking on him. But it's his damn fault because he's the one who named the hard problem. So he deserves to be the target of criticism. He's become a dualist because he can't figure out how the brain makes the mind. And so therefore the mind must be made by things that are not material. If it's made by things that are not material, then we have to have two kinds of stuff out there. Material stuff that operates according to mechanistic principles, non-material stuff that operates according to other principles, which we haven't figured out yet. And we are in the realm of Mysterianism. Owen Flanagan called Chalmers and his those who agree with him here, the new Mysterians. The old Mysterians were the ones that inserted supreme beings and broke things down in terms of whether or not they had spiritual components or whether they were secular components. The new Mysterians are the ones that have essentially done the same trick, but instead of bringing in a supreme being, they simply deal with some other way in which mental events are caused without having to have material components behind them. Believe it or not, this has actually dragged some very smart people into taking on an even more, sorry, being so critical, crazy position of panpsychism. Because they can't figure out how consciousness emerges, because they don't have the emergentist dilemma tucked into their back pocket with a solution, they've decided that it's everywhere, that panpsychic principles are the right ones. A recent paper was published by a well-known philosopher on this, titled Panpsychism is Crazy, but it's probably right. But it's not right. It's crazy. And I could go into gory detail with you about why panpsychism is so nuts. But what's bothersome to me is let's get that out of there. Let me just. How am I doing on time? I'm fine. All right. So it's a few quick. Everyone knows what panpsychism, right? Panpsychism is that the universe is conscious, that everything is conscious. Consciousness pervades all things. It emerges from an earlier quasi-religious position called animism, where the notion is there's some essence that each thing has. And this essence of it animates it at that particular level. So a rock has rockness about it. And a chair has chairness about it, and the forest has forestness about it, and animism pervades everything. There is virtually no early culture or society that anthropologists have uncovered that does not begin its religious traditions with animism. It's a very alluring and it's a very attractive position, and I could go into some detail about it. It has to do with our capacity to detect agents. We're very good at detecting agents out there. And as soon as we have this agency detection component of it, bang, you're going to get animism. It's almost unpreventable. But panpsychism is more sophisticated than that. And there are actually some very sharp people that are behind it. The two that are most intriguing to me are Giulio Tonini and Christoph Koch. They're first-rate neuroscientists. Tonini has one of the most productive and inventive laboratories looking at sleep and the neurocognitive and biocognitive functions of sleep. And Koch, or Koch, I guess he pronounces it now. He's originally German. He directs the Allen Institute for Neurocognitive Functions in Seattle, and at the same time he maintains a lab at California Institute of Technology. Also, both of them have the interesting sort of tidbit that they both have worked with and published with Nobel Prize winners. So we're talking about top scientists. They've embraced a form of panpsychism that is just nuts. And it's fascinating to me how they got into this. Tononi is the one who began it because he came up with this mathematical theory of consciousness, which is based upon the number of parts that are in any entity and the degree of interaction of those parts. Now, the parts have to interact. If they don't interact, there's no consciousness there. He maintains that he can measure the degree of consciousness. He calls it phi. And it has to do with the number of interacting parts in that particular collective that you're looking at. So a camera that just sits there, not interacting with anything, does not have consciousness. A toaster just sitting there does not have consciousness. But if you take the camera and you put it into a self-driving car where it is interacting with many of the components that are in it, consciousness now emerges in that system. So it's sort of a quasi-panpsychic point of view, because if things aren't interacting, you don't get consciousness. And the amount of consciousness that you get is based upon the number of interacting parts. Now, they get some very interesting data from cortical function that I won't bother to go into that looks supportive. And that's where they've gotten most of their mileage. But the problem is that there's some fundamental aspects about this model that are just incoherent. One of the things they point out is that if you have a pile of sand, it doesn't have consciousness because the particles aren't interacting. But if you vibrate the stand on which the sand is sitting, it begins to form strata based upon the size of the particles. Now they're interacting. Did that pile of sand just become conscious? Is it true that the camera that is put into a Tesla suddenly becomes conscious? At one point in Koch's new book, he says he's kind of waiting for the internet to reveal its conscious self, because he thinks that it's getting to the point where the number of interactive elements in it are sufficient for consciousness. Notice, folks, we're back in hardware-independent functionalism again, where we're back in playing the game where this consciousness can emerge from structures that have nothing to do with biology and nothing to do with organic forms. I just happen to think this is an interesting road if you're an AI researcher. This is an interesting game to play if you're in robotics. But it's not a particularly interesting game if you're trying to really understand what underlying consciousness is. Oh, by the way, has anyone ever read F for Frankenstein? Arthur C. Clarke's book was published in 1980, not book, it was a short story, published in 1981. He anticipated the Tononi-Koch model because in the story, it's, excuse me, did I say 81? 1961. The telephone system around the world finally becomes so interconnected with so many little sort of electronic neurons and so many nodes and so many interlocking wires that it wakes up. Every single phone in the world rings simultaneously, and this new entity emerges. And the reason it's called Frankenstein is because it takes over. It's now a conscious being with its own goals and intentions, motivations, and it takes over, and it's now wreaks havoc throughout the rest of the world. And in some sense, Koch and Tononi are pointing to or looking at the same sort of thing operating. Anyway, Mysterianism is avoided if we go with the CBC. Minds are biophysical machines. There's no need for dualism. There's no need for panpsychism. The hard problem is now resolved. Current efforts start and end with human consciousness, or they start with humans and look for analogs in other species. This is what's gotten us in trouble. Neither has gotten us close to solving the hard problem. But on the other hand, with the CBC model, the discovery process changes. Search for the initial conditions for the creation of life. Consciousness, sentience will be there. It's waiting for you. Go find it. Because without sentience, a species just will not survive. Problems not resolved. There are things we haven't solved with this issue. Plants. Well, we just got a full hour and a half on the sentience of plants. Plants are eukaryotes. Here's the problem the CBC model has. One of the nice things about taking walking out to the end of the 15? Oh, piece of cake. I'm 7 minutes over? All right, let me go to as quickly as I can over this, okay? You have to be honest if you're going to do this kind of work. Plants are eukaryotes. They appeared some 2 billion years after the prokaryotes. Evolution is conservative. If it works, keep it. You don't jettison something if it's been functional. Sentience is metabolically expensive. Now, here's the question. If I'm arguing prokaryotes are conscious and the eukaryotes emerge later, and plants are eukaryotes, and plants are not sentient, that means that they must have jettisoned it, given up on sentience when they emerged. This is unlikely because evolution is conservative. It's very rare in evolutionary biology to find a species that gave up something. I only know of one. Some of you may know of others, let me know. It's the hagfish. It gave up its spine. The spine is a powerful, beautiful thing. Once you get a vertebrae, you're not going to give it up. The vertebra is just powerfully important, and for the entire, group within species, the vertebrates, they held on to them. The hagfish gave it up. The guy who discovered this referred to it as a case of a spectacular degeneracy. That's how rare this kind of a thing is. So if plants aren't conscious, if they don't have sentience, it means they gave it up. Why would they do this when it's so useful? Well, for one, sentience is metabolically expensive. Motility. This is the issue I raised earlier when František was giving his talk. Do sessile species need minds? Ultimately, the CBC is agnostic on this issue. As Stephen had pointed out earlier, I started out merely a year or two ago adamant. I'm no longer adamant. The reason I'm no longer adamant is I keep emailing back and forth with František, and I keep reading his stuff, and he sends it to me, and he's on his way to convincing me. We were just chatting outside. It's very hard for scientists to change their minds, even though they're supposed to be objective creatures that look at data and analyze it dispassionately. But he may be dragging me, kicking and screaming into this issue, but I'm still not convinced. Scientific problems to focus on. I'll get out of here. This is a big one. How do multicellular species evolve? And note, it took evolution nearly 3 billion years to pull this trick off. For 3 billion years, the only things living on this bloody planet were single-cell species. How do multicellular species come to have singular conscious experiences? This is a big one. We're composed of trillions of cells. According to the CBC, each one has its own subjective entity, stuff. Running out of words here. But we have singular experiences. So when you get a multicellular species, it's going to have singular cellular experiences, rather than each of its individual cells having a Pointillisme-like experience. And we have this, sort of mosaic of subjectivity. That doesn't make a lot of sense. I think what happens is individual species develop particular specializations. I'm better at metabolism. I'm better at detecting light. I'm better at detecting noxious events. You're better at subjectivity. And so for metabolic efficiency, the individual cells evolve in this cooperative so that each collection of them takes on certain subjective experiences and certain functions. And one group of them becomes the group that handles the sentient components for the full collective. Now, again, these are issues that micro and macrobiologists are actually working on. They're struggling with how these things happen, trying to get at the underlying, molecular components of them. These problems haven't resolved. Stephen is going nuts over there. The hard problem is resolved, and we're done. The book will be out sometime in the next couple of months, Oxford University Press. Feel free to give it as birthday presents to all your friends.
Thank you very much. It's very thought-provoking again, quite challenging, I think, for me as an evolutionary biologist. Do you want to start, kick off?
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks a lot. Okay, so you mentioned here and there that you wanted to play fast and loose with terms, and so here I am asking you to not do that. And it might just be like a professional bias or something, but I think I sympathize with the editor that you mentioned. You might wonder, like, okay, well, what do we mean by learning, and what do we mean by memory and other cognitive functions, such that we could recognize those kinds if they appeared in single cell organisms? I don't know what the answer to that question is, but I do wonder to what degree you think. Suppose we grant, for example, that those processes, those responses that look like behaviors that we see in in bacteria are really forms of learning and memory and communication. Why should we think that there is that's like indicative of the presence of consciousness, of feeling things? That seems to be the going way that we're talking about things this summer school. And a closely related question for you is, do you think consciousness is a matter of degree? So that, obviously this is kind of a fraught question, but there are some out there who are of the mind that, well, certain simple organisms possess consciousness to a certain degree, and more complex organisms possess it to a greater degree. So, yeah.
Well, on the definitional thing, I'm using these terms in, we'll call a folk psychology way. The sort of the notion of what consciousness is, or what learning is, or memory is pretty much the way in which people would discuss it on the street without being in any technical literature. There's an entire appendix in the book on the efforts to define consciousness. And it's pretty funny. And it starts with my efforts. Mine and Rhiannon's were co-authors of the Dictionary of Psychology. And of course, you can't write a dictionary of psychology if you're not going to define the word consciousness. And I went back and took a look at it, and it's okay, but it isn't very helpful because it just wanders all over the place like a drunken sailor. And I'm not alone. And so the decision I made was, look, I'm not going to try to nail these terms down because I don't think it's particularly useful to. And I'm also going to borrow from Christoph Koch. He said that sometimes, in fact, more than sometimes, quite often, you gain by not trying to define your terms because it puts you in a conceptual box. And you won't consider the possibility that some of the elements that are involved in the topic under discussion might be useful to talk about. And so the decision we made was that's how I'm going to handle it. And if you don't like it, that's okay. Now, what was the other question?
Degree.
Oh, yes.
Degree.
Yeah. The other question, well, one of the criticisms of the approach that people like Frentischek and I take is Dan Dennett phrased it nicely. Dan has a way of phrasing things that's really quite appealing. And he loves alliteration. And so he said there's a distinction between competence and comprehension. Now, pre-conscious species, by the way, he doesn't like the term consciousness for a variety of reasons, but I won't go into those now. But species that are not conscious, they have competence. They have an ability to do things. They have an ability that looks like they can learn. They have an ability to put on these kinds of displays that they can get away from a noxious stimulus. But they don't have any understanding. They don't have any comprehension. They don't know that stimulus was noxious. What they're doing is simply reacting to the stimulus response, a very mechanistic kind of way with no subjectivity. Now, that's the standard model that people take when they're arguing against something like the CBC. And my problem with it is what Dan has bought for himself is a huge emergentist dilemma. What point along evolution does suddenly the capacity for comprehension come in? At what point does understanding emerge? It's a better scientific strategy to assume it starts at the beginning and just continues to evolve in more complex.
The second question was about degree of consciousness.
Well, that's it. What happens is different functions are taken on. As you get into more complex environments, you get in situations where new problems need to be resolved. The process of natural selection, aided by epigenetic elements that we're now beginning to understand more and more about, take in, and you get more and more complex stuff. There's no goal here. There's no teleological components to it. It's just what happens. You and I, our species, we're not inevitable. The kind of cognitive functions that human beings display, they're an evolutionary accident. It's good that we got here because now we can look back and smile and say, isn't that cool? But for 3 billion years, they were just single-celled organisms. The aliens come, okay? They check it out. What do we got here? Got consciousness here? Nope, don't see any of it here.
That
Okay.
does not sound like an answer to that.
Excuse me?
Does not sound like an answer to the second question. It's a simple question. Are there degrees of consciousness?
Consciousness is a label for subjectivity for internal representational systems that have a what's it like to be, what's it like to be a fill in the blank. Are there different degrees of this? There are different forms of it. There are different variations. There are different varieties. Do you want to put them along some scale of complexity or scale of cognitive function? You can. I mean, we can do things that I don't know, howler monkeys can't do. Octopuses can do things that we can't do.
Okay, got it. That was not my question. Okay, so
Do you want to ask your question?
yes, let me ask my question. In fact, let me make my
Well, you want to ask his question?
David Chalmers did not invent the hard problem.
No, he named it.
He named it.
Yeah.
The hard problem used to be called the mind-body problem.
Yeah.
Now I'm going to state it to show that there is no solution to the so-called emergentist dilemma, which is basically to explain when did the solution to the hard problem appear. The hard problem is if you have an organism that can do something and you have an explanation, a physiological, functional explanation of how it does it, a causal explanation, and you've explained what it can do, how do you explain that it feels if it feels? That is the hard problem, okay? The question about degree was about degree of feeling. It's not interesting. Sometimes I feel more, sometimes I feel less. What you need to explain if you're going to solve the hard problem is how and why organisms feel. And what you think that you've done is by reducing the hard problem to just one cell way back then, that somehow you've made it more tractable. On the contrary, you've put it in broad relief. Why should any of that stuff that you described for that first cell be felt?
Well, I think the answer is that it is because without it, you would not get a viable an organism.
And why is that? Why are we to believe that?
Because the organism has to be able to navigate a complex environment.
Navigating is doing. We've explained the doing.
It all emerges at the same time. I don't see what the problem is. When you get life, you get sentience. When you have an organism that has to navigate a complex, difficult environment, it has feelings. It has subjective experience. It's part of the package. My guess is that what we'll find is that the Origin of Life crowd, I mean, they award an Origin of Life prize every year to whoever's done the most interesting research getting at how life first emerges. When these folks finally figure it out, I will bet you we'll discover the biomolecular components that also produce sentience.
May I just come in here with my question and I move on? So I wrote this down as you were talking because it seemed to me, that mind and consciousness and sentience, you use them interchangeably. Is that roughly right? Yes, it is.
Let's just use sentience as the umbrella term over the whole thing. Okay.
And the other one then is, so are you essentially saying that mind, consciousness, sentience is the facility or the process or the mechanism that allows an organism to respond adaptively to the environment over its lifetime? In which case, of course, what you're saying is it's not falsifiable. That's evolution. That's natural selection.
Yes.
Okay. So then basically you've reframed what a mind is, or consciousness or sentience by saying it's the facility of an organism to adapt to its environment flexibly and as in adaptively in the sense of passing on its genes to the next generation.
Yes.
Okay, so but then it's a circular argument, isn't it? So it's not falsifiable.
Of course it's falsifiable. All you have to show is that when
No,
you
only
get...
if evolution stops.
No. Once we've worked out what the underlying biomolecular components are, is dead easily falsifiable. All you have to do is, tweak a molecule and pull it out and see if sentience is still there. See if you still have the adaptive functions.
Okay.
It's actually the same sort of strategy that people take when they work with anesthetics. The argument is, how do you know whether a specific organism is conscious, whether its mind is operating and functioning? Well, you anesthetize it. And if it stops doing those things, you say, okay, well, it's no longer conscious. So it's a parallel, it's analogous kind of argument.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks. So let me first just say, I also have a certain amount of skepticism about just blanket accusations of anthropomorphism. But that said, I'm a little worried about how much of a role anthropomorphism seems to be playing in your work. So we have good examples of how readily people are willing to attribute intentions to things like robots, or even there's been work showing where you have a person look at a computer screen, and a couple dots are moving around the screen, and then you ask the person to describe what they've just seen, and they ascribe intentionality or intentions to these dots when they explain what happened. And you went into it a bit in your talk when you talked about animism, just like how seductive this kind of view of the world is. So I worry that when you were doing your talk, it seemed like a lot of, when you're describing the behaviors of fairly simple organisms, it seemed to me that you're just saying, well, why wouldn't we ascribe something like memory or altruism to this sorts of behavior? Why does this differ from the case of when somebody looks at a couple dots move around on a screen?
You've seen that little film, was it John and Marge, and just two dots, and
Yeah.
it moves as John, Marge, like moves over here, John. That's the entire dialogue is John and Marge. Maybe it's Mary or something. And by the time you're done, you know they're lovers, and you know they're in bed together. It's really very seductive. There's a long section in the First Minds on this issue. With regard to robotics, it's become fascinating. There's an ethical roboticists movement. There are people there are actually several countries that are in the process of passing laws to protect robots. Now, actually, they're really designed not to protect robots, but they're designed to protect people who have emotional reactions, sometimes quite severe, when they see something go wrong with a robot. Turning a robot off makes people anxious. Destroying a robot can make them really unhappy, especially if the robot looks like us, which many of the modern Android-oriented ones do. So yeah, this is a lot of issue. There's a long section on anthropomorphism because this is really a big issue. Because if you do anthropomorphism badly, you really get yourself in trouble. The clever Hans fallacy, the smart horse, that one doesn't happen without anthropomorphism. That's anthropomorphism gone wrong. But on the other hand, as people like Franz de Waal have pointed out, anthropomorphism is one of the intuitive pumps. It's a driving engine of a lot of comparative work and comparative ecology. And so, I try to balance these things because, your points are exactly right. They're good. And these are complex issues. There are people who look at the legal issues with regard to robotics and the belief that robotic life is real. So, yeah, thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi. So you were mentioning Dennett and Daniel Dennett. And I read a few chapters from his new book, From Bacteria to Back and Back. And I was wondering, how is your book gonna, are you taking some cues from his book, or are you going further than what he was saying? So yeah, what are your thoughts on what he said in his book? And what are your new thoughts in your book?
Well, actually, Dan and I are old friends. We've got close to 40 years now, and we've been agreeing and disagreeing on a variety of topics over that time. I happen to just adore him. I just think he is one of the most fascinating, provocative thinkers of the last 50 years. I've sent Dan a bunch of pieces from the book saying, look, if I got you right. And he says, yeah, you got me right, but you're wrong. And I said, well, if I got you right, then you could be wrong too. And anyway, my point basically is with Dan, he cannot let go of his behaviorism. And what my crack is that he can't shuck his inner Ryle. He took his degree with Gilbert Ryle. Gilbert Ryle was doing his very best to take behaviorism and make it acceptable by putting in the mind and introducing cognitive notions. And that's what Dan was trained in. And he really can't let that go. That's one of the reasons why he doesn't like the notion of consciousness. He thinks it's the underlying mechanisms that are operating in consciousness is a user's illusion, is what he calls it. And I just think it's wrong. And one of the reasons that I have problems with Dan is what I was alluding to a minute ago, is that he's got a huge emergentist dilemma. Because he's got to point out where in the development of the complexity of various species you get from competence to comprehension. And if he can't do that, and it's unsatisfactory to put everything into behavioral terms, then he's got a problem. And we'll see. I suspect he'll review this book and get out his knife and slice it, dice it up. And say, it's okay, I don't mind.
Thank you very much.
It's a very simple question. When you said not solve but resolve near the beginning, the first thing I did is Google Translate. What's the difference? And it turns out that Google Translate says in French is the same thing. So I only have one category. I'm probably not the only one. Could you please define where's the difference between solve and resolve, please?
Resolve means that I'm not going to worry about it anymore. Because it doesn't need to be solved, because it's been resolved. We can spend a lot of time worrying about things. I mean, if you look, again, I said I had a subspecialty of the history of psychology. And looking back over this, the panoply of work that's been done over the last 150 years, a lot of problems that really energized, exercised people faded away. They were resolved. And they were resolved not because they were solved, but because another framework was created within which to see them. Another scaffold was built upon which to hang these ideas. And more progress was made taking that approach than the previous one. And so I wouldn't say that the issues that are raised by behaviorists were solved. They were resolved. They were resolved by reconstituting them in more cognitive and neurocognitive frameworks. And that's the sort of thing so when I say the hard problem is resolved, that's essentially what I mean.
Okay, so we shouldn't worry about it anymore.
Well, people are going to worry about it.
But there's no answer to it.
No, I don't.
Yeah,
see,
okay.
I think that one of the problems with the way in which Chalmers and others, he's certainly not alone, have approached the hard problem is that it cannot be solved within that framework, which is why they ended up themselves in this Mysterianism. They ended up as dualists. They ended up as panpsychics. I mean, that's a road you don't want to travel down. Panpsychism, as John Searle, great crack was, this is so wrong it doesn't even get to the point of being false.
Thank you. My understanding is that you've relieved us of the burden of it with your CBC.
I do my best.
There are two more there?
Yes. So one of your assumptions was that consciousness was a requirement for survival. It's just that sometimes when I'm in unconscious state, my brain is probably taking a lot of decision to keep me alive. For say when I'm sleeping, for example, I am not aware of anything, yet I'm still alive. Or if I had a traumatic brain injury and I was in an unconscious state. So why do you believe that why do you believe that consciousness needs a causality? Like, why? You're adding a function to consciousness which may not be a requirement. I mean, I could live just with my vegetative states, breeding.
Yeah, when you get to a really complex species like you and I think me, you're in a situation that I was trying to I just hinted at earlier about how multicellular organisms come to have singular experiences, but those are all built on complex layers that are evolutionarily determined. In my other research on the cognitive unconscious, the operations and functions that take place at the implicit level, they take place largely outside of consciousness. That's because they're based upon very old evolutionary mechanisms. Again, I know I keep saying this, but in the book, there's a long section that tries to deal with the complexities that are involved in this. These two theoretical frameworks, the one that comes from implicit learning and tacit knowledge, and the one that I'm developing here in the CBC model, they share a common evolutionary framework. And your question's a good one, and all I can do is say when the book comes out, take a look. See, it may not make you happy, but you'll at least get to see how I try to struggle with that issue.
We've just had we're running vaguely out of time sign, so we can fit in 2 more questions, I think, and 2 answers.
Okay,
Thank
well,
you.
my question is in line with my colleague here. If we agree that all conscious or all living beings are conscious, I guess it's a bit of an emergentist dilemma. Then how does unconsciousness exist? Does it exist in all conscious beings? How did it came to be?
Well, I think what happened is what I hinted at earlier, which is when you get a multicellular organism, you start getting this functional specificity. There's certain groups of cells begin to take on particular functions. Some are sensory, some are control locomotion and movement, and some, handle with the conscious experience, what it's like to be that organism function. And so the other stuff is the unconscious stuff. And so an awful lot. What really captures the functions of the cognitive unconscious is the detection of patterns of covariation among elements in the world around you. So what you're picking up is the relationships between an event here and the probability that some other events will occur afterward. The more sophisticated the system that you have, the more complex and more tenuous these statistical relationships, these stochastic relationships can be detected. But that's taking place unconsciously. And it's taking place unconsciously because these are based upon fundamental functions that have to take place before this kind of top-down component is there. But the thing is, the top-down component, the way we view it for a complex species like us, has to do with the fact that we've evolved these specified functions, these units, these modules. When you go back to a primitive organism, you don't have these. What you have is the singular representation, which is the conscious subjective experience. This is why I'm using the term sentience, because you can see the mess you get into when you start trying to call it, is this a mind? Is this consciousness? And the answer is no, this is sentience. You're detecting the stuff that's out there and you're getting a representation of it. There is something it is like to be a bacterium in pain. That's it.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
There's nothing it's like to be a toaster.
I would like to take a take on your multicellular organisms. If you're giving cognition or sentience to single cells, and then you're wondering how we get a singular experience for multicellular organisms, would you consider an ant colony, for instance, to be conscious? And if so, why not entire ecosystems with no singular consciousness? As long as they can memorize, learn, and communicate?
Yeah, people here keep asking really fascinating questions. I congratulate everybody. Thank everybody here. There are phenomena called swarm behavior, and there's what's called quorum sensing, and these are would almost feel like emergent properties of large groups of coordinating social species. And I would not want to say that a termite colony itself had consciousness, but I'm comfortable saying that the individual consciousnesses of each of the termites coordinate in a social way that produces a large panoply of functions and behaviors. But I would not want to say that each individual, that there's any sentience outside of the combined sentience of the individual organisms. Because once you take that step, you've taken the first tiptoe down the road of panpsychism again. And you're going to get yourself into problems that you really don't want to be in. So that would be my answer to it.
Thank you very much, Arthur. Before we thank everybody, we've got a couple of announcements.
This discussion will continue at 2 o'clock, not 4 o'clock as usual, but at 2 o'clock in the panel. František and Arthur will be there, and several discussants, including a new one who just called in that he can come. The head of the robotics lab at McGill, Greg Dudek, will be here as well. So save your questions for the panel session. And remember that at 4 o'clock, instead of a panel, it's for the students who are taking the course for credit. We're going to discuss your topics for your papers. So please come for that as well. Thank you.
So then let's thank František and Arthur for their gracious answering of what I thought were very impressive and sharp questions. So thank you very much.